Imagine you could open a door, not a metaphor, not a thought experiment, an actual door buried under 60 feet of volcanic rock and centuries of silence, waiting in the dark beneath the Bay of Naples since the year AD 79. In 1748, a team of Italian explorers cracked that door open, and what they found on the other side stopped the modern world cold. Loaves of bread, still sitting in the bakery oven, charred, yes, turned to carbon, but there, the shape of them, the weight of someone's Tuesday morning, frozen mid-motion by a mountain that had been quietly building pressure for centuries. Graffiti on the walls, not carved, painted. In that rushed, messy scrawl, you recognize instantly because you've seen it in 1,000 bathroom stalls. Lovers' names, insults, a phone number, a poet's boast. Marcus loves Spendusa. Restitutus has cheated many girls, 2,000 years old and somehow completely familiar. Mosaics on the floors, intricate, obsessive, beautiful. A dog, a sea creature, a warning written in tile, Cave Canem. Beware of the dog. Someone had a dog. Someone had a Tuesday. Someone had a love life complicated enough to put on a wall. That's the thing about Pompeii that breaks you open, if you let it. It doesn't feel like history. It feels like eavesdropping. But here's what the cinders of Pompeii are really telling us, if we know how to listen. They're not just a postcard from a doomed city. They're a clue, a single puzzle piece from a picture so vast, so staggering in its ambition and its violence and its beauty, that we've spent 2,500 years trying to understand it. They're a window into Rome. And Rome, the real Rome, not the marble fantasy version you've seen in movies, is something else entirely. Rome is the story of a cluster of mud huts on a swampy riverbank that, through a combination of military genius, political cunning, breathtaking arrogance, and sheer stubbornness, became the engine of Western civilization. It gave us our laws, our languages, the very shape of our cities. The idea, still radical, still contested, that a government should answer to the people. It is the story of how one city stretched its reach from the windswept coasts of Britain to the sand dunes of Syria. How it absorbed everything it conquered, languages, gods, philosophies, foods, and turned them into something new. It is the story of assassinations and civil wars, of philosopher emperors and lunatic tyrants, of slaves who became generals and senators who became cowards, of a faith born in a province that would eventually reshape the empire itself, of a 1,000-year empire that fell not in a single crash, but in a slow, grinding unraveling, and then, impossibly, kept going for another 1,000 years under a different name. And it ends here, May 29th, 1453, Constantinople. The last Roman emperor tears off his purple robes to fight as a common soldier at a crumbling gate. The thunder of Ottoman cannons shaking the walls that have stood for 1,000 years. From mud huts to that final, magnificent stand, roughly 2,200 years of human history, compressed into one civilization's wild, improbable arc. This is the entire history of Rome. Strap in. Every great civilization tells itself a story about where it came from. Usually, that story involves gods, miraculous births, and someone doing something heroic with a sword. Rome's origin story has all of that. It also has a she-wolf, twin brothers, a murder, and the haunted memory of a burning city on the other side of the Mediterranean. Let's start with the official version, the Roman version, the one that every schoolchild in the Republic memorized and every poet embellished. After the Greeks sacked Troy, this is roughly 1200 BCE, give or take, a Trojan prince named Aeneas escaped the flames with his elderly father on his back and his household gods clutched to his chest. He wandered the Mediterranean for years, driven by prophecy and misfortune, eventually landing in central Italy, in a region called Latium. His descendants, several generations down the line, would produce twin brothers, Romulus and Remus. Their mother was a Vestal virgin. Their father, according to the story, was Mars, the god of war, which, if you know anything about Roman history, feels entirely appropriate. The twins were thrown into the Tiber River by a jealous uncle who didn't want competitors for the throne. They didn't drown. Instead, a she-wolf found them on the riverbank and nursed them back to health. A shepherd named Faustulus eventually discovered the boys and raised them as his own. They grew up. They overthrew the uncle. They decided to found a new city, and then one of them killed the other. The argument was, reportedly, about which hill to build the city on. Romulus had chosen the Palatine. Remus mocked him, leaped over the half-built wall to prove how flimsy it was. Romulus killed him on the spot. Some accounts say in rage, some say it was calculated. Either way, Romulus founded Rome. April 21st, 753 BCE. The city gets its name from its murderous founder, which tells you something essential about Rome before we've even started. Now, here's where it gets interesting. What the dirt actually says, archaeology doesn't exactly confirm Romulus. No wolf-nursed princes have turned up in the ground. But archaeology does tell us something that's arguably more remarkable. The mythic timeline is surprisingly close to right. By the mid-8th century BCE, right around the traditional founding date, the scattered Iron Age villages on the hills above the Tiber began doing something new. They started merging. The huts on the Palatine Hill, crude structures of wattle and daub with post-hole foundations, were being supplemented by larger communal spaces, a nascent market, evidence of shared religious practice, the first stirrings of what we'd eventually call an urban identity, Latin pottery, Etruscan influence from the north, sophisticated engineering, religious ritual, city planning concepts, Greek cultural currents from the colonies in southern Italy, what the Romans would later call Magna Graecia, literacy, trade networks, artistic sensibility. The Romans didn't emerge in isolation. They were, from the very beginning, a synthesis, a meeting point of cultures. They took what they needed from everyone around them, and they called it Roman. That, too, feels essential. The Seven Kings, a crash course. Roman tradition lists 7 kings between the founding and 509 BCE, when the monarchy ended. Historians treat these figures with appropriate skepticism. Some may be composites, some may be entirely invented, some may be real people whose actual deeds got mythologized beyond recognition. But the pattern they describe is coherent, and it tracks with the archaeological record in broad strokes. Romulus himself, the founder. He created the Senate as an advisory council, divided citizens into tribes for military purposes, and established the first religious rites. He also populated Rome by kidnapping the women of a neighboring tribe, the Sabines. This is called the rape of the Sabine women in the historical literature, and it is exactly as troubling as it sounds. Numa Pompilius came next, and he's presented as Romulus's opposite. Pious rather than violent, a lawgiver rather than a warrior. He established the calendar, has created the Vestal Virgins, the women who tended Rome's sacred flame, and organized the priesthoods. A Sabine by origin, he reportedly replaced warlike chaos with structure and ceremony. Tullus Hostilius conquered Alba Longa, doubling Rome's population overnight. Ancus Marcius pushed to the sea and founded the port of Ostia. Tarquinius Priscus brought Etruscan sophistication, advanced drainage systems, organized games, elaborate religious ritual. The Cloaca Maxima, Rome's great sewer, which still functions today, 2,500 years later, is attributed to his era. Servius Tullius reorganized Roman society into a system based on wealth and military contribution rather than birth alone. He demarcated the city boundaries and built massive defensive walls. And then came Tarquinius Superbus, Tarquin the Proud, the last king. He is remembered as a tyrant, which in the Roman world meant not just cruel, but specifically one who rules without law, without the consent of the governed, as though the state were his personal property. He executed rivals without trial. He ignored the Senate. He flouted the customs that held Roman society together. Under his reign, the seeds of revolution were planted. What finally triggered the harvest was a crime committed not by the king himself, but by his son. Her name was Lucretia. She was the wife of a Roman nobleman, and by all accounts a woman of impeccable reputation in a society that obsessed over female virtue. She was renowned for her weaving, not a trivial detail in that world, where a woman's domestic diligence was considered a direct reflection of her moral character. Sextus Tarquinius, the king's son, raped her. Lucretia told her father and her husband what had happened. She demanded vengeance, and then she killed herself, a knife, there in front of them, because she could not bear to live under the shadow of dishonor. The men took her body into the streets of Rome. They held it up. They gave a speech. In the speech, they talked about the crimes of the Tarquin family, not just Sextus, but the king himself. Years of tyranny and contempt. A family that had treated the Roman people as servants and the Roman state as their personal inheritance. The crowd, and this matters because what happened next required the crowd agreed. The Tarquins were driven out of Rome, the gates were shut against them, and Lucius Junius Brutus, one of the men who had given the speech, made a declaration that would echo for centuries. Rome would never again be ruled by a king. The year was 509 BCE, and in place of the monarchy, the Romans invented something new: the architecture of the Republic. The Roman Republic was not a democracy. Let's be clear about that up front, because the confusion between the two concepts has caused a lot of historical mischief. It was a system designed not to give power to the people, but to prevent any single person from accumulating too much of it. Two consuls, elected annually, shared executive authority. Each could veto the other. They served for exactly 1 year and then returned to private life. The word dictator actually existed in the republican system, but it meant something specific: a temporary emergency authority, appointed for no more than 6 months to deal with a crisis. The Roman dictator was designed to expire. The Senate held no formal legislative power. Technically, it was an advisory body, but in practice, it was the engine of the state. Its members were former magistrates, drawn from Rome's wealthiest and most prestigious families, serving for life. They controlled foreign policy, finances, the assignment of military commands. Their decrees were called Senatus Consulta, the consultations of the Senate, and while theoretically non-binding, in practice only a very brave or very reckless man ignored them. And then there were the assemblies, the Centuriate Assembly, the Tribal Assembly, where Roman male citizens voted on laws, elected officials, and declared war. The assemblies gave the Republic its democratic veneer. The structure of those assemblies, weighted heavily toward wealth and property, ensured that the wealthy had far more influence than their numbers warranted. It was, in other words, a system built by elites for elites, but it was also a system that contained, buried in its foundations, a revolutionary principle. The law is above the ruler. No man, not even a consul, was exempt from it. That idea had consequences that took centuries to fully unfold. The conflict of the orders, Rome's first-class war. The Roman world at the dawn of the Republic was divided into 2 groups, patricians and plebeians. Patricians were the aristocracy, the old families who claimed descent from the original Senate appointed by Romulus. They monopolized the consulship, the priesthoods, the judicial system. They controlled interpretations of the law, which wasn't even written down yet, which meant they could make it say whatever was convenient. Plebeians were everyone else. Most were poor farmers. Some were wealthy merchants and craftsmen. All of them were excluded from the political system that governed their lives. In 494 BCE, the plebeians did something extraordinary. They left. They called it a secessio, a secession. The plebeians, who formed the backbone of Rome's army, simply walked out of the city en masse and refused to come back until their grievances were addressed. Rome, without its common soldiers, was Rome without a military. The patricians, whatever they thought privately, had to negotiate. What followed was more than a century of slow, grinding, occasionally violent political struggle that historians call the conflict of the orders. The plebeians, through strikes and assemblies and the occasional riot, extracted concession after concession. In 450 BCE, Rome's laws were written down for the first time, the 12 tables, displayed publicly in the Forum, so that magistrates couldn't simply invent interpretations on the fly. In 367 BCE, the Licinian Sextian laws opened the consulship to plebeians. By 287 BCE, the Lex Hortensia declared that resolutions passed by the plebeian assembly were binding on all Roman citizens, regardless of patrician objection. The patrician monopoly was broken, not overnight, not without blood, but broken. In its place emerged something new, a blended aristocracy of wealth and merit, technically open to anyone with enough money and ambition and the right family connections. This is what the Romans would call the nobles, the nobility, and they would dominate the Republic for the next 2 centuries. Meanwhile, Rome was doing something else entirely, something it had a particular genius for. It was conquering its neighbors. The Italian Wars, from city to peninsula, Rome's expansion across the Italian peninsula, was not a grand strategic plan executed by a central authority. It was messier than that, more opportunistic, more driven by immediate threats and local politics and the logic of alliance networks than by any master design. But the cumulative result, by around 264 BCE, was staggering. Rome controlled, directly or through alliance, virtually the entire Italian peninsula. The Volsci, the Equi, the Etruscans, the Samnites, one by one, either conquered and absorbed or bound to Rome by treaty obligations that required them to supply troops and submit to Roman foreign policy. The Samnite Wars of 343 to 290 BCE were the defining crucible. The Samnites were tough mountain people, skilled fighters, and they handed Rome one of its most humiliating defeats, the Battle of the Caudine Forks in 321 BCE, where an entire Roman army was trapped in a mountain pass, stripped of weapons and dignity, and forced to march beneath a wooden yoke as a symbol of submission. Rome did not forget. Rome never forgot. 20 years later, the Samnites were subdued. 2 decades after that, they were allies. That was Rome's pattern: defeat, absorb, integrate. Conquered peoples became junior partners in Roman expansion. Their soldiers marched under Roman eagles. Their elites sent their sons to Rome for education. Their gods took up residence in Roman temples. It was empire before empire had a name. By the time Rome looked beyond Italy, it was not merely a city-state. It was a system, a network of obligations and identities and military capacity that could project force across the Mediterranean in ways that would have been unthinkable 2 centuries earlier. And the first thing that caught its eye, looking out across the blue water to the south and west, was Carthage. Carthage was everything Rome was not. Where Rome was a land power built on agriculture and infantry, Carthage was a maritime empire built on trade. Its navy commanded the western Mediterranean. Its merchants ranged from the coasts of West Africa to the tin mines of Cornwall. Its warehouses were stuffed with the wealth of 3 continents. It was, in terms of per capita wealth and commercial sophistication, probably the most prosperous city on Earth in 264 BCE. It was also, unfortunately for both parties, in the way. The First Punic War started over Sicily, specifically over a squabble between local factions on the island that somehow escalated into a full-scale confrontation between the 2 greatest powers in the Western Mediterranean. It lasted 23 years. It was fought mostly at sea, which presented Rome with a fundamental problem. Rome had essentially no navy. Rome's solution to this problem is one of the great stories in military history. The Romans found a wrecked Carthaginian warship on the beach. They studied it. In 60 days, they built copies. 120 warships, assembled by a society that had never built warships before, crewed by men who had never rowed a trireme in their lives. And then, because they couldn't outmaneuver the Carthaginian navy, they invented a device called the corvus, a boarding bridge with a spike that could be dropped onto an enemy deck. They turned sea battles into infantry battles, which was the one kind of fighting they actually knew how to win. By 241 BCE, Carthage sued for peace. Rome got Sicily, its first overseas province. The template was set by Hannibal. the man who nearly ended everything. If the First Punic War was Rome's first act in the Mediterranean drama, the Second Punic War was the scene where the audience genuinely believed the hero might die. Hannibal Barca was the son of a Carthaginian general who had fought in the First Punic War and never forgiven Rome for what he saw as a dishonest peace. Legend has it that the elder Barca made young Hannibal swear, as a child, that he would be Rome's eternal enemy. Whether the story is true or not, Hannibal lived as though it were. In 218 BCE, he did something that military historians still argue about. He marched an army of roughly 40,000 men, including war elephants, actual war elephants, across the Alps in winter. The crossing killed a third of his forces and most of the elephants. It also put him in northern Italy before Rome had any idea what was happening. What followed was 3 years of catastrophe for Rome: Trebia, Lake Trasimene, and then Cannae in 216 BCE, still studied in military academies today as one of the most devastating battlefield defeats in history. Hannibal lured a Roman army of 70 to 80,000 men onto a flat plain, feigned retreat in the center to draw the Romans forward, wrapped his flanks around them, and annihilated the enclosed force. Somewhere between 50 and 70,000 Romans died in a single afternoon. The Senate received the news: 1 consul dead, 2 legions destroyed, Hannibal's cavalry riding through the Roman countryside, Italian allies defecting to Carthage, the road to Rome itself open and undefended. And Rome did something that confounded everyone who observed it, then and now. It refused to negotiate. No embassy, no surrender terms requested, no acknowledgement, official or otherwise, that defeat was even a possibility. The Senate passed emergency measures. New legions were raised from whatever men were left. Slaves were freed and armed. The fleet was rebuilt. And Quintus Fabius Maximus, the man who would be called the Delayer, was appointed dictator with a radical strategic concept. Don't fight Hannibal directly. Harass him, cut his supply lines, deny him the decisive battle he needed. The strategy was mocked. Fabius was called a coward. It worked anyway. Hannibal was brilliant in the field and helpless everywhere else. He couldn't besiege Rome. He lacked the siege equipment. He couldn't get reliable reinforcements from Carthage, whose government was more interested in politics than in supporting the general fighting their war. He could win every battle and still be slowly strangled. While Hannibal marched through Italy, never losing a major engagement, a young Roman general named Publius Cornelius Scipio took the war to Spain, cutting off Carthage's resources, and then, in 204 BCE, invaded North Africa itself. Carthage recalled Hannibal from Italy to defend the homeland. At the Battle of Zama in 202 BCE, Scipio defeated Hannibal. The tactics Hannibal had invented were turned against him. Carthage surrendered. Scipio returned to Rome and was given the title Africanus. He had ended the greatest threat Rome would face for centuries, and in doing so, he had revealed something essential about the Roman character. It was not the most tactically brilliant civilization on earth. It was not the richest, or the most sophisticated, or the most culturally refined. It was the most stubbornly, catastrophically, almost pathologically unwilling to accept defeat. That quality, that refusal, was both Rome's greatest strength and the seed of its eventual destruction. But we're getting ahead of ourselves. Empire without the name after Zama, Rome's expansion accelerated in ways that were not always planned, or even, strictly speaking, desired. Macedonia had allied with Hannibal during the darkest years of the Second Punic War. Rome did not forget. A series of Macedonian wars between 215 and 148 BCE ended with the destruction of Macedonian power at the Battle of Pydna in 168 BCE, a battle so decisive that the ruling dynasty simply ceased to exist. Greece was next, absorbed with a combination of military force and political manipulation. Corinth, the richest city in Greece, was razed to the ground in 146 BCE as a demonstration of Roman seriousness. The same year, Carthage was destroyed after the Third Punic War. Not just defeated, destroyed, its population enslaved, its buildings demolished, its site allegedly salted to prevent regrowth. The statement was unmistakable: cross Rome, and not just you, but everything you built will be erased. By the mid-2nd century BCE, Rome was the unquestioned master of the Mediterranean basin. Provinces from Spain to Syria paid tribute. Governors appointed by the Senate administered territories larger than many modern countries. The wealth pouring into Rome was staggering. Art, slaves, grain, precious metals, all flowing toward the Tiber. And then something began to go wrong. Not with Rome's armies, not with its foreign policy. Something went wrong at home. The inequality that had always existed in Roman society began to reach levels that the existing political system simply couldn't contain. Wealthy elites, enriched by conquest, were buying up the small farms that had been the backbone of the Republic. Farms whose owners had gone off to fight in Spain or Greece and returned to find their land sold for debt. Landless Romans flooded into the city, crowding into multi-story apartment blocks called insulae. Dependent on cheap grain distributions and gladiatorial games to survive, the Senate, dominated by the very men who had profited from this arrangement, saw no problem that required addressing. A tribune named Tiberius Gracchus disagreed, and when he acted on that disagreement, he set in motion a chain of events that would ultimately destroy the Republic. The Roman Republic was built on an implicit bargain. The powerful would govern, and in exchange they would govern with at least nominal respect for the law, the traditions, and the consent of the citizen body. It was a bargain that everyone understood, that wasn't written anywhere, and that held for centuries through a combination of social pressure, shared values, and the practical realities of power. In 133 BCE, Tiberius Gracchus broke the bargain, and then the Senate killed him for it. And in doing so, the Senate broke the bargain worse. Tiberius was a Roman aristocrat from an impeccable family. He was not a revolutionary. He was a reformer, deeply traditional in his analysis, actually, arguing that Rome was weakening itself by allowing small farmers to be displaced from the land. Because small farmers were the source of the legionary soldiers on whom the Republic's military power depended. His solution was to redistribute public land, land that had legally belonged to the Roman state but had been squatted on by wealthy families for generations, back to landless citizens. The Senate blocked the reform. Tiberius bypassed the Senate and took his proposal directly to the plebeian assembly. This was technically legal. It had been done before, but it violated the unwritten rules, the established understanding that you didn't make major policy changes without senatorial consent. A mob of senators, the men who ran the Roman state, attacked Tiberius and his supporters at the assembly. They beat him to death with wooden chairs and the legs of benches. 300 of his supporters died with him. This happened in the Forum Romanum, in daylight, with witnesses. Nothing was ever the same after that. The generals take the stage. The Republic's next century was a slow-motion collapse, punctuated by moments of spectacular violence and individual brilliance. Two figures, more than any others, built the machine that eventually destroyed the system. Gaius Marius was a new man, a novus homo, as the Romans called it, meaning a man whose family had never held high office. He was from a provincial family with no ancestral prestige, and he rose through the system on talent alone, which the Roman aristocracy found both impressive and deeply suspicious. Elected consul and unprecedented 7 times, Marius transformed the Roman army from a citizen militia into a professional force. Previously, soldiers were required to own property. Military service was a citizen's obligation, not a career. Marius opened the legions to the landless poor, equipped them at state expense, and promised them land grants at discharge. The result was a military revolution. The new legions were better trained, better disciplined, and more cohesive than anything Rome had fielded before. They were also deeply, personally loyal, not to Rome, not to the Republic, not to the Senate, but to the general who fed them and paid them and promised them a future. Marius had, without quite intending to, created private armies inside the structure of the Roman state. Lucius Cornelius Sulla understood immediately what that meant and was the first to act on the understanding. Sulla was everything Marius was not, an aristocrat from an old patrician family, fastidiously traditional in his personal habits, deeply committed to the primacy of the Senate, and absolutely ruthless in pursuing his own advancement within that framework. In 88 BCE, when Sulla had been assigned a prestigious military command in Asia Minor, and Marius's political allies arranged to have it transferred, Sulla did something unprecedented. He marched his army on Rome, a Roman general, a Roman army, occupying the Roman capital, killing Romans in the streets. The taboo had been broken. The Republic's bloodstream was infected. After Sulla's eventual victory in the resulting civil war, he became dictator, not the traditional 6-month emergency appointment, but an unlimited dictatorship. He drew up proscription lists, names of political enemies who were declared outlaws, whose property was forfeit, who could be killed by anyone with impunity and a claim to the reward. Thousands died. And then, and this is the genuinely strange part, Sulla resigned. He retired to his country estate in 79 BCE and died there the following year, reportedly of liver failure. He had demonstrated that one man with the right army could seize the state. He had also demonstrated, bizarrely, that such a man might choose not to keep it. That demonstration would not survive the next generation. Pompey, Crassus, and the man who changed everything. The decades after Sulla produced a new type of Roman politician, the military celebrity. Men who used foreign wars to build personal prestige, personal wealth, and personal armies, then leveraged all three in domestic politics. Gnaeus Pompeius Magnus, Pompey the Great, was the prototype. By his mid-20s, he had already demanded and received a triumph, Rome's highest military honor, despite being technically ineligible for it. He cleared the Mediterranean of pirates in a single campaign, so efficient that modern military planners still study it. He conquered the eastern Mediterranean, reorganizing everything from the Black Sea to the Red Sea into Roman provinces and client kingdoms. He was, in 63 BCE, when he returned to Rome, probably the most powerful man in the world. Marcus Licinius Crassus was the richest man in Rome, possibly the richest man in the world. His wealth was built partly on silver mines, partly on slaves, and partly on a business model that strikes modern observers as breathtakingly cynical. He owned Rome's private fire brigade, and his crews would arrive at a burning building and negotiate a purchase price with the owner before deciding whether to actually fight the fire. And then there was Julius Caesar. Caesar came from an old patrician family, technically prestigious, practically broke. He was charming, brilliant, politically astute in ways that bordered on supernatural, and chronically in debt from funding his own political career. He understood the new Rome instinctively. The formal structures of the Republic still existed, but the real power flowed through personal networks, military loyalty, and the ability to deliver tangible benefits to the right people. In 60 BCE, Caesar arranged a private alliance, later called the First Triumvirate, though the Romans didn't use that word at the time, with Pompey and Crassus. Pompey got land for his veterans. Crassus got favorable tax arrangements for his business interests. Caesar got the consulship for 59 BCE, followed by the governorship of Gaul. Gaul was where Caesar went to become great. The Rubicon, 9 years. Caesar spent 9 years in Gaul, systematically conquering what is today France, Belgium, and parts of Germany. He crossed the Rhine. He crossed the English Channel twice. He enslaved and killed so many Gauls that ancient sources put the death toll in the millions, numbers that modern historians debate but cannot dismiss entirely. He also wrote about it in a series of dispatches back to Rome that are still read in Latin classes today. Clean, precise, utterly self-serving prose in which Caesar always speaks in the third person and always makes exactly the right decision. It is the most successful political memoir in Western history. Meanwhile, the triumvirate was disintegrating. Crassus died at the Battle of Carrhae in 53 BCE, leading an ill-conceived invasion of Parthia. His army destroyed, his severed head reportedly used as a prop in a Greek drama being performed at the Parthian court at the time of its arrival. Pompey drifted toward the Senate's camp. The two remaining giants circled each other. In 49 BCE, the Senate, under Pompey's influence, ordered Caesar to lay down his command and return to Rome as a private citizen. Caesar would then be immediately prosecuted by his political enemies and destroyed. Caesar stood at the Rubicon River, the legal boundary between his province and Italy proper, with 1 legion. The law was clear. No general could cross the Rubicon with his army. To do so was treason. He crossed. Alea iacta est. The die is cast. Whether he actually said it, the sentiment is perfect. It was the moment the Roman Republic ended, not in 44 BCE when Caesar was assassinated, not in 27 BCE when Augustus formalized the new order, but here, at this river crossing, when a general made the calculation that the law could not protect him, and therefore the law did not bind him. Civil war followed. Pompey fled to Greece. Caesar pursued him and defeated him at the Battle of Pharsalus in 48 BCE. Pompey fled to Egypt, where he was murdered on the beach by Egyptian courtiers who had decided Caesar was the safer bet. Caesar arrived in Egypt, became entangled in an Egyptian succession dispute, allied himself with the younger claimant, a 21-year-old queen named Cleopatra VII, and spent 9 months there, during which time he was nearly killed by a mob, fought a naval battle in Alexandria harbor, and possibly fell in love. Probably that last part was politics. With Caesar, it was always hard to tell. Caesar returned to Rome in 45 BCE, the undisputed master of the Roman world. He had defeated Pompey, mopped up Pompeian resistance in Africa and Spain, and eliminated every serious military challenger. He was appointed Dictator Perpetuo, Dictator in perpetuity, not for 6 months, forever. He was 55 years old and moving fast. In the 18 months between his return and his death, Caesar enacted more substantial reforms than Rome had seen in a generation. He extended citizenship to communities across the Roman world. He reduced debt burdens. He restructured the calendar. The Julian calendar he introduced would remain in standard use across Western Europe for 1,600 years. He began massive infrastructure projects, a new forum, drainage works, road building. He planned a Parthian campaign. I probably intended to avenge Crassus and extend Roman territory to the Caspian Sea. He also did things that made the Senate's older members reach, metaphorically and eventually literally, for weapons. He accepted divine honors. He wore the purple robe that was associated with kings. He allowed his face to be put on coins while he was still alive, which no Roman had ever done before. He was appointed to a priesthood that had previously been reserved for kings. He allegedly received foreign delegations while seated, rather than rising in greeting, as custom required. Whether Caesar actually wanted to be king, in the formal, hereditary sense, is a question historians argue about still. He may have been building toward it. He may simply have been so far beyond the existing categories that no one, including Caesar, quite knew what to call what he had become. Either way, on March 15th, 44 BCE, the Ides of March, a group of approximately 23 senators, led by Marcus Junius Brutus and Gaius Cassius Longinus, surrounded Julius Caesar in the theater of Pompey and stabbed him 23 times. He fell at the base of a statue of Pompey and bled to death. The assassins had expected the Roman people to cheer. They had expected the Republic to simply resume the way it had after Sulla retired, as though this were a fever that had broken rather than a transformation that was irreversible. Instead, the crowd at Caesar's funeral was so enraged that it tore apart a man named Cinna, not because he was one of the conspirators, but because his name was Cinna, and one of the conspirators was also named Cinna. The mob ripped him to pieces on the street before anyone could explain the mistake. The Republic was not coming back. Octavian, the boy who would be everything, Caesar's will revealed that he had adopted his 18-year-old grandnephew, Gaius Octavius, as his heir and son. The young man, who would now be known as Gaius Julius Caesar Octavianus, or simply Octavian, arrived in Rome to claim his inheritance. Mark Antony, Caesar's senior general and most prominent ally, made the mistake of dismissing him. "Mere boy," Antony reportedly said. It was an understandable assessment. Octavian was young, physically unimpressive, frequently ill, and had no military experience whatsoever. He also had Caesar's name, and Caesar's money, and a talent for political survival that would turn out to be the most potent weapon in the post-Caesar world. The next 14 years were a masterclass in ruthlessness disguised as patience. Octavian allied with the Senate against Antony. He defeated Antony. He then immediately reconciled with Antony and formed the Second Triumvirate, this one legally formalized, with Antony and a minor figure named Lepidus. Together, they issued proscription lists that killed 300 senators and 2,000 equestrians, including Cicero, Rome's greatest orator and the most eloquent defender of the old republic. They defeated the forces of Brutus and Cassius at the Battle of Philippi in 42 BCE. Both conspirators died there. Then Octavian and Antony divided the world between them. Octavian took the west. Antony took the east, where he settled into a complex alliance, political, military, and romantic, with Cleopatra the Seventh of Egypt. The propaganda war that followed was spectacular and vicious. Octavian portrayed Antony as a man bewitched by an Oriental queen, abandoning Roman values for Egyptian luxury, planning to move the capital to Alexandria and rule the world as an Eastern monarch with a foreign wife. Antony's supporters responded in kind. The actual war was over quickly. At the naval battle of Actium in 31 BCE, Octavian's general Agrippa outmaneuvered Antony's fleet. Antony and Cleopatra fled to Egypt. Octavian followed. As he approached Alexandria, both Antony and Cleopatra killed themselves, Antony by sword, Cleopatra, according to legend, by asp. Octavian was 32 years old. He controlled the entire Roman world, and now he had to figure out what to do with it. Octavian knew what had killed Julius Caesar, not knives. Caesar was killed by the perception that he wanted to be a king, that he was going to unmake the republic, that the old senatorial families would lose their place, that the word rex was coming back to Rome. So, in 27 BCE, Octavian staged one of the most brilliant political performances in history. He appeared before the Senate and announced that he was returning all his extraordinary powers to the Senate and the Roman people. The emergency was over. The Republic was restored. He was stepping back. The Senate panicked. After a century of civil war, the last thing Rome wanted was another power vacuum. They begged him to stay. They heaped honors on him. They gave him a new name, Augustus, the revered one, and comprehensive authority over the frontier provinces, which meant authority over most of the army. They gave him tribunician power, which meant the right to veto anything, and imperium maius, which meant his military authority superseded everyone else's everywhere. Augustus never called himself king, never called himself dictator. He called himself princeps, first citizen, just the most important senator, merely the man in charge of keeping the peace. It was, and this must be said clearly, an absolute monarchy disguised as a constitutional republic. The Senate still met. Consuls were still elected. The forms of the republic continued. But real decisions, military, financial, foreign policy, were made by one man, and everyone knew it, and most people were fine with it, because the alternative was another century of civil war. Augustus ruled for 41 years. During that time, Rome was transformed. The Age of Marble Augustus famously boasted that he found Rome a city of brick and left it a city of marble. It was only slight exaggeration. He rebuilt or erected over 80 temples. He created the Aura Pacis, the Altar of Peace, a magnificent monument to the Pax Augusta, the Augustan peace. He reorganized the city into administrative districts, created a professional police force and fire brigade, and oversaw the construction of roads and aqueducts that would serve the empire for centuries. The cultural patronage he fostered was equally ambitious. Virgil, working under the eye of Augustus's close ally, Maecenas, composed the Aeneid, the great Roman epic, tracing Rome's origins to Troy, and presenting Augustus himself as the fulfillment of Roman destiny. Horace wrote odes celebrating the moral renewal of Roman life. Livy produced his monumental history of Rome from the founding to Augustus's day. It was, in other words, state-sponsored mythology, magnificent, beautifully crafted, enduringly influential state-sponsored mythology, but mythology nonetheless. Ovid, brilliantly, refused to play along. His Ars Amatoria, a wry, knowing guide to the arts of seduction, was so at odds with Augustus's campaign for moral revival that the emperor eventually exiled him to a town on the Black Sea, where he spent the rest of his life writing poetry about how much he wanted to come home. That exile tells you something real about the Augustan age. It was genuinely prosperous, genuinely stable, genuinely impressive, and it was also, in ways subtle, and sometimes not so subtle, a police state in a marble costume. The Julio-Claudians, 5 emperors, 5 variations. When Augustus died in 14 CE, he had managed to create something the Republic had never had: a stable succession. His stepson Tiberius was the designated heir, his tribunician power already transferred, his position unambiguous. The Julio-Claudian dynasty that followed, Tiberius, Caligula, Claudius, Nero, each connected to Augustus by blood or adoption, ran for 54 years and included some of the most colorful reigns in Roman history, which is a polite way of saying that several of them were disasters. Tiberius was competent and deeply unhappy. He governed well in the early years, maintaining the treasury, avoiding expensive wars, keeping the frontiers secure. Then he retreated to the island of Capri, leaving Rome effectively in the hands of his praetorian prefect, Sejanus, who used his position to conduct a reign of terror against the senatorial class. When Tiberius eventually realized what was happening and had Sejanus executed, the damage was done. He died in 37 CE, mourned by approximately no one. Caligula's reign started brilliantly. He was young, he was charming, he ended the treason trials, and then, within a year, collapsed into something that ancient sources describe in terms ranging from extravagant tyranny to actual madness. He demanded to be worshipped as a living god. He reportedly made his horse a consul, or at least threatened to humiliate the Senate. He spent the treasury on spectacles and then executed wealthy senators to replenish it. He lasted 4 years. Praetorian Guard officers assassinated him in a palace corridor in 41 CE, also killing his wife and infant daughter. Claudius, discovered hiding behind a curtain, when the Praetorians came looking for someone to acclaim emperor, was a scholar with a stammer whom his own family had always dismissed as an embarrassment. He turned out to be an excellent administrator. He reorganized the imperial bureaucracy, oversaw the conquest of Britain in 43 CE, and built major public works. He also had a catastrophically poor record in marriages. His third wife was executed for conspiracy, and his fourth, his niece Agrippina the Younger, almost certainly poisoned him in 54 CE to ensure the succession of her son. Nero. Nero is a special case. The early years of Nero's reign, guided by the philosopher Seneca and the Praetorian prefect Burrus, were genuinely good. Tax cuts, reduced sentences, a more conciliatory relationship with the Senate. Then Nero had his mother murdered. He arranged to have her drowned at sea, and when she survived the sinking boat, had assassins sent to finish the job. And from there, the story gets progressively stranger. He performed publicly as an actor and singer in an era when performing arts were considered degrading for any person of status. He built the Domus Aurea, the Golden House, a palace complex so vast that it included a landscaped park with an artificial lake in the heart of Rome. After the Great Fire of 64 CE, which Nero may or may not have started, depending on which source you believe, he blamed the Christian community, initiating the first organized state persecution of Christians. By 68 CE, his own Praetorian Guard had abandoned him. The Senate declared him a public enemy. He fled and committed suicide, reportedly requiring assistance from a freedman because he couldn't quite bring himself to do it alone, with the words, or so tradition has it, "What an artist dies with me." Nero's death triggered the Year of the Four Emperors, 69 CE, perhaps the most chaotic 12 months in Roman history, during which Galba, Otho, Vitellius, and Vespasian each claimed the purple in succession. Vespasian, a tough, practical general of common origin, who had been suppressing the Jewish revolt in Judea, emerged as the winner. He founded the Flavian dynasty and began work on the Colosseum on the site of Nero's drained pleasure lake. His son Titus presided over the destruction of Jerusalem in 70 CE, an event that ended the Jewish state and scattered much of the Jewish population across the empire, and the eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 CE, which buried Pompeii and Herculaneum under 40 feet of volcanic material and gave us our window into the Roman world. The good emperors then, in 96 CE, the Senate assassinated Domitian, the second Flavian emperor, who had been sliding toward exactly the kind of overt tyranny that made senatorial necks vulnerable, and made a choice that would define the next century. They chose Nerva, an elderly senator with no military background and no personal army. He was a transitional figure, and he knew it. What he did that mattered was adopt a successor. Marcus Ulpius Traianus, Trajan, a Spanish-born general with an outstanding military reputation and genuine popularity with the troops. That adoption, choosing the best available candidate rather than the nearest available relative, launched what later historians would call the era of the five good emperors: Nerva, Trajan, Hadrian, Antoninus Pius, Marcus Aurelius, a century of relative stability, competent governance, and genuine prosperity that would come to be remembered as the height of Rome. Trajan pushed the empire to its greatest territorial extent, north into Dacia, modern Romania, east into Mesopotamia. His column still stands in Rome, spiraling upward with its carved record of the Dacian campaigns, a stone comic strip 200 meters long. Hadrian reversed course, pulling back from Trajan's eastern conquests and focusing on consolidation. He built Hadrian's Wall across northern Britain, a frontier marker that still winds across the Northumberland landscape today, and traveled ceaselessly through the provinces, personally inspecting troops and settlements, building temples and libraries. He was brilliant, restless, deeply Hellenistic in his tastes, and genuinely interested in the empire as a thing worth preserving rather than merely a resource to exploit. Antoninus Pius presided over perhaps the most peaceful reign in imperial history. No major wars, no persecutions, no crises. Just 40 years of quiet, competent administration. The empire breathed, and then Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. Marcus never wanted to be emperor. He was a student of Stoic philosophy, a man who genuinely preferred reading and writing to the exercise of power. He wrote his Meditations, private philosophical reflections, never intended for publication, during the long years he spent on the Danube frontier, fighting Germanic tribes, because the empire he was supposed to be peacefully governing decided to attack simultaneously from multiple directions. The Antonine Plague, probably smallpox, swept the empire during his reign, killing perhaps 5 million people. The Marcomannic Wars consumed years of his life. He held the line. He always held the line. And then he made the one decision that historians have never quite forgiven him for. He named his son, Commodus, as his successor. Commodus was not a philosopher. Commodus fought as a gladiator in the Colosseum, not symbolically, not for spectacle. He actually fought in the actual arena against actual opponents who knew very well what would happen to them if they won. He announced that he was Hercules reincarnated. He renamed Rome after himself. He emptied the treasury on spectacles while neglecting the frontiers. He was strangled in his bath in 192 CE by a wrestler hired by court officials who had decided, correctly, that Commodus was planning to have them killed. His death triggered a power struggle that produced 5 competing emperors in a single year, resolved when Septimius Severus, an African-born general, marched on Rome and installed himself. He gave his soldiers a famous piece of advice at the end of his life. Live in harmony, enrich the soldiers, ignore everyone else. His successors took the second and third parts of that advice and ignored the first. What followed is called the Crisis of the 3rd Century, and it was one of the most catastrophic periods in Roman history, a 50-year stretch of almost continuous civil war, barbarian invasion, plague, economic collapse, and military anarchy, during which more than 20 men claimed the title of emperor. Most of them reigned for months before being killed by the next claimant. The Sassanid Persian Empire had replaced the old Parthian state and was aggressively expansionist. In 260 CE, the Persians captured the Roman Emperor Valerian in battle, the first time a Roman emperor had ever been taken prisoner by a foreign power. He died in captivity, reportedly used as a mounting block by the Persian king. Gothic tribes crossed the Danube. Frankish and Alemannic warriors crossed the Rhine. The Gallic Empire, a breakaway state comprising Gaul, Britain, and parts of Spain, seceded from Rome entirely, simply because Rome couldn't protect it. Queen Zenobia of Palmyra seized Egypt and Asia Minor and proclaimed herself Empress of the East. The Roman Empire, for a period in the 260s CE, had literally ceased to exist as a unified entity. Aurelian, the Restorer. What saved Rome was a series of extraordinary soldiers who clawed it back from the edge. Claudius Gothicus defeated a massive Gothic invasion and was planning to follow up the victory when he died of plague in 270 CE. Aurelian, who succeeded him, is one of the most underrated figures in Roman history. A career soldier of obscure origin who, in 5 years of relentless campaigning, defeated Zenobia, recaptured Egypt and Asia Minor, defeated the Gallic Empire, and reunited the fractured Roman world. He also built the Aurelian walls around Rome itself, thick, massive, still largely intact today, because by the 200s and 70s, barbarian raiders were reaching the outskirts of the Italian heartland, and Rome proper needed defenses for the first time in centuries. The walls were an admission of vulnerability. They were also a magnificent piece of engineering. Aurelian earned the title Restitutor Orbis, Restorer of the World. He was assassinated in 275 CE by junior officers who feared, incorrectly, that he was planning to have them killed. The crisis continued in a diminished form until Diocletian seized power in 284 CE and imposed a solution so radical that it effectively created a new empire on top of the ruins of the old one. Diocletian's Revolution. The Tetrarchy. Diocletian was a Dalmatian soldier, the son of a freed slave, if some sources are correct, who rose through the ranks to become one of the most effective reformers in Roman history. He looked at the empire he had inherited and concluded that its fundamental problem was structural. It was too large for one man to govern, and the succession system was too dependent on bloodline, which produced emperors like Commodus. His solution was the Tetrarchy, 4 rulers, 2 senior emperors called Augusti, and 2 junior emperors called Caesars. Each controlled a specific region of the empire, commanded the legions there, and was responsible for defending those frontiers. Each Caesar was designated heir to the Augustus he served under, ensuring planned succession rather than civil war. He also massively expanded the imperial bureaucracy, dividing provinces into smaller units to reduce the power of any individual governor, and reorganized taxation to provide more stable funding for the military. On the cultural and religious front, Diocletian was deeply conservative. He favored traditional Roman paganism and viewed the growing Christian community as a destabilizing influence. In 303 CE, he launched what is called the Great Persecution. Churches destroyed, scriptures burned, Christians ordered to sacrifice to the traditional gods or face imprisonment, torture, and death. The persecution was the last of its kind. It was also, in retrospect, Rome making a catastrophic bet against the future. In 305 CE, Diocletian did something that no Roman emperor had ever done before, and that virtually no Roman emperor would ever do again. He voluntarily abdicated. He went to his palace in Split, on the Dalmatian coast, now modern Croatia, and grew cabbages. When political allies came to beg him to return to power, he reportedly told them to go look at the cabbages he'd grown with his own hands. They were magnificent. The Tetrarchy collapsed almost immediately after his abdication, producing yet another round of civil wars, from which emerged a man who would transform Rome more thoroughly than anyone since Augustus. Constantine, the god of this world. Constantine I was the son of one of Diocletian's Caesars. When his father died in 306 CE, Constantine's troops proclaimed him emperor at York in Britain, against all the rules of the Tetrarchic succession. He spent the next 18 years fighting his way to sole control of the Roman world, and in 312 CE, on the eve of the decisive Battle of the Milvian Bridge, he saw, or said he saw, or found it politically convenient to say he saw, a vision in the sky, a symbol, the Chi, the first two letters of Christus in Greek, and the words, "In this sign, conquer." He put the symbol on his soldiers' shields. He won the battle. In 313 CE, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan, full legal toleration for all religions throughout the empire, including Christianity. This was not yet the establishment of Christianity as the state religion, but it was the beginning of the end of persecution and the beginning of an extraordinary reversal. Within a generation, the faith that had been systematically killed would be the faith of the emperor himself. Constantine intervened in theological disputes, presiding over the Council of Nicaea in 325 CE, the gathering that produced the Nicene Creed and the condemnation of Arianism, with the authority of an emperor rather than a bishop. He endowed churches, he exempted clergy from taxes, he made Sunday a public holiday, he appointed Christians to positions of power across the empire. He also moved the empire's capital. In 324 CE, he chose the site of Byzantium, a small Greek city on the strategic narrows of the Bosphorus, and began building a new Rome. It was dedicated in 330 CE and would be called Constantinople, the city of Constantine. It was magnificently positioned, protected by water on three sides, commanding the sea route between the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. Close to the rich eastern provinces that generated most of the empire's wealth, Constantinople was the future. Rome, beautiful and symbolic, and increasingly irrelevant to military and economic reality, was the past. Constantine died in 337 CE, baptized on his deathbed in the traditional fashion of his era. Many Christians delayed baptism until the end of life, since it washed away sin, and there was nothing to gain from running out of sins before you needed washing. He had changed the world. The Roman Empire was still standing, but it had become something new. The fall of Rome is the most misunderstood event in Western history. Most people imagine it as a crash, a moment when the lights went out, when civilization ended, when something magnificent and eternal was smashed by barbarian hordes. That image is wrong in almost every particular. What actually happened was slower, stranger, more ambiguous, and in some ways more heartbreaking than the dramatic collapse the imagination conjures. Let's start with the date that textbooks use, 476 CE. On September 4th of that year, a Germanic warlord named Odoacer deposed a 16-year-old emperor named Romulus Augustulus. The name is almost too perfect, combining the name of Rome's mythical founder with a diminutive of Augustus, and sent the Western imperial regalia to the emperor in Constantinople. There was, he informed the Eastern court, and no longer any need for a separate Western emperor. He would govern Italy as a king. That's the moment. That's what 476 CE is. But here's what makes it strange. Almost nobody noticed at the time. Roman law continued. Roman administrative structures continued. The Senate in Rome continued to meet. The Catholic Church continued its slow accumulation of authority and property. People in the Western provinces continued to think of themselves as Romans, or at least continued to operate within Roman legal frameworks, use Roman currency where it still existed, and aspire to Roman cultural standards. What had actually ended was not Roman civilization. What had ended was the Roman government's capacity to effectively project military force across the Western provinces. The empire had been dissolving for decades before Odoacer's coup. The barbarians were already inside. The crisis began on the Danube frontier in 376 CE. The Huns, a nomadic people from the steppes of Central Asia, whose origins and culture remain somewhat mysterious even to modern historians, had been pressing westward, displacing everything in their path. The Visigoths, a Germanic people who had been living in a more or less stable relationship with the empire on the far side of the Danube for generations, were caught between the Huns behind them and the Roman frontier before them. They asked permission to cross, to settle inside the empire as refugees. The Eastern Emperor Valens agreed. This was not inherently a catastrophic decision. Rome had absorbed barbarian groups before, settling them as foederati, allied troops, in exchange for military service. What made it catastrophic was the execution. Corrupt Roman officials cheated the Visigoths on the promised food supplies, enslaved their children, and generally treated the new arrivals with contempt rather than the careful management that made integration work. The Visigoths revolted. At the Battle of Adrianople in 378 CE, they annihilated a Roman army and killed Valens himself. It was the worst Roman military defeat since Cannae, 600 years earlier. The new Eastern Emperor, Theodosius I, eventually made peace with the Visigoths, settling them inside the empire as a semi-autonomous group that remained, culturally and militarily, Visigothic rather than Roman. It was a pragmatic solution and a sign of Rome's diminished capacity. The empire could no longer simply absorb and assimilate. It had to accommodate. Theodosius was also the last emperor to rule the entire Roman Empire. When he died in 395 CE, he divided it between his two sons, Arcadius in the east, Honorius in the west. The administrative division that had existed in practice for decades became permanent. Honorius was 10 years old. He would spend much of his reign in Ravenna, which offered better defenses than Rome, while his capable general Stilicho, half Vandal by birth, held the western frontier together with a combination of military skill and desperate improvisation. Alaric and the sack of Rome Alaric, the Visigothic leader, had been trying to get what he considered a proper deal from the Western Empire for years, a formal military command, land for his people to settle, recognition of Visigothic autonomy within Roman structures. By the standards of Roman foreign policy, his demands were not outrageous. Rome kept stringing him along and then backing away. In 408 CE, Stilicho, the general who had been blocking Alaric's advances, was executed on trumped-up charges by Honorius's court, which had grown paranoid about his power. Rome thus eliminated its most competent general at the worst possible moment. Alaric marched on Rome 3 times. The first 2 he accepted payment to go away. The third time, in August 410 CE, his forces entered the city. For 3 days, the Visigoths sacked Rome. They took gold, silver, art, ransomed wealthy citizens. They reportedly spared the major Christian churches. Alaric's own Visigoths were, by this point, Christian, which added a theological layer of complexity to the whole affair. The damage, in material terms, was significant, but not catastrophic. What was catastrophic was the psychological impact. Rome had not been sacked by a foreign enemy in 800 years. The city that considered itself eternal had been violated. Saint Jerome, living in Bethlehem and receiving the news by letter, reportedly wept for days. If Rome can perish, what can be safe? Augustine of Hippo, in North Africa, wrote his masterwork The City of God, partly in response, an argument that the earthly city, even Rome, was always secondary to the city of God, and that Christians had placed their faith in something more durable than marble and power. Alaric died shortly after, and his Visigoths eventually settled in southern France and Spain under a treaty arrangement. But the pattern was set. The disassembly. The next 60 years were the disassembly. The Vandals crossed from Spain to North Africa in 429 CEE and captured Carthage in 439, severing Rome's access to the grain that fed the city and the tax revenues that funded the army. The Huns, under Attila, swept across the Balkans and then into Gaul in 451 CE, where a coalition of Romans and Visigoths stopped them at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains. Attila then invaded Italy in 452 CE. He withdrew after a meeting with Pope Leo I, whether for reasons of diplomacy, disease, or divine intervention, depends on who you ask. Attila died the following year. His empire dissolved within a generation. The Western Empire continued in name, but it was governing an ever smaller portion of its theoretical territory. Spain, Visigoths, North Africa, Vandals, most of Gaul, Franks, and Burgundians. Britain, Roman administration had effectively collapsed around 410 CE, leaving the local population to deal with Germanic settlers arriving from across the North Sea. The last truly effective Western emperor was Valentinian III, and he was murdered in 455 CE by men loyal to a general whose wife had been forcibly married to the emperor. In the same year, Geiseric's Vandals sailed from Carthage and sacked Rome again, this time more thoroughly than Alaric had. The subsequent 20 years saw a rapid turnover of puppet emperors, controlled by whoever had the strongest military backing at the moment. When Odoacer finally deposed Romulus Augustulus in 476 CE, it was almost an administrative formality. The Western Empire had already ceased to function. He was just making it official. Director's note. Beat. Silence. Then. But here's what the textbooks almost never tell you. Rome didn't fall. Not entirely. Not everywhere. In the east, in the city of Constantinople, behind walls that no army had yet breached, the Roman Empire was still very much alive, and it would stay alive for another 1,000 years. They never called themselves Byzantines. That's a name invented by a 16th century German historian, used retrospectively to distinguish the Eastern Empire from the Western one. The people who lived in Constantinople, who ruled from the shores of the Bosphorus, who administered an empire that, at its height, stretched from Italy to Mesopotamia. They called themselves Romans, Romaioi in Greek. They believed, without qualification, that they were the continuation of the Roman Empire, the only continuation that mattered, and in a real sense, they were right. The Eastern Empire had always been the richer half. It contained the largest cities, Alexandria, Antioch, Constantinople itself, cities of hundreds of thousands of people. It had the most productive agricultural land. It commanded the trade routes between Europe and Asia. While the West had been unraveling, the East had been consolidating, reforming, and building institutional capacity that would sustain it through crises that would have destroyed any other state. Justinian, the last Roman who tried to restore it all. The most dramatic figure in Byzantine history, and possibly one of the most remarkable rulers in world history, came to power in 527 CE. His name was Justinian I, and he wanted everything back. Everything, meaning the western provinces that Rome had lost, North Africa, Italy, Spain, the entire Mediterranean basin, unified under Roman law, Roman authority, the Roman god. He sent his greatest general, Belisarius, who may have been the finest military commander of the early medieval world, to North Africa in 533 CE. Belisarius destroyed the Vandal kingdom in less than a year. He then invaded Italy, pushing the Ostrogoths back in a grinding, devastating 20-year war that ultimately succeeded but left the Italian peninsula depopulated, its agriculture destroyed, its cities shattered. Justinian also did something that would outlast all his military conquests by more than a millennium. He codified Roman law. The Corpus Juris Civilis, the body of civil law, organized and systematized the accumulated legal tradition of Rome, going back to the 12 tables, the Code, the Digest, the Institutes. It became the foundation of legal systems across medieval and early modern Europe. It is the ancestor of the legal frameworks used in most of continental Europe, Latin America, and much of the rest of the world today. When you hear the phrase, the rule of law, when you understand that no person, not even a ruler, is above the legal system, that idea, in its Western form, traces back to Roman jurisprudence as organized and transmitted by Justinian. Not bad for a dead empire. He also built Hagia Sophia, the Church of Holy Wisdom, completed in 537 CE, was the largest building in the Christian world for 1,000 years. Its dome, hovering above the nave on what appeared to be a ring of windows, creating the illusion that it floated unsupported, was an engineering achievement so extraordinary that contemporaries said it seemed to be suspended from heaven by a golden chain. When Justinian first entered the completed church, he reportedly said, "Solomon, I have surpassed you." It may have been the single most justified boast in architectural history. Justinian's reconquests did not survive him intact. The plague of Justinian, the first major outbreak of bubonic plague, which arrived in 541 CE and killed millions across the empire and the Mediterranean world, possibly between 25 and 50 million people over the following 2 centuries, weakened the empire's capacity to hold what it had taken. Italy was largely lost to the Lombards, within years of Justinian's death, but the legal legacy and Hagia Sophia remained. The Islamic shock, the 7th century, brought the most serious external challenge the Byzantine Empire would face until the 15th. In 610 CE, or rather, beginning in 610 CE and spreading outward with a speed that stunned the world, a new faith emerged from the Arabian Peninsula. Islam, born in Mecca, spread first through Arabia and then carried by Arab armies, fired with religious conviction and led by extraordinary commanders across the Middle East with breathtaking velocity. Byzantium lost Syria in 636 CE, Palestine in 637 CE, Egypt, the breadbasket of the empire, the source of the grain that fed Constantinople, in 641 CE. These were not peripheral territories. They were the richest provinces, the most populous cities, the agricultural and commercial core of the empire. The effect was catastrophic. The empire shrank by perhaps half its territory and more than half its tax revenue within a decade. Arab fleets besieged Constantinople itself twice, in 674 to 678 CE, and again in 717 to 718 CE. Both times the city held. The secret weapon was Greek fire, a chemical compound that burned on water and could not be extinguished by any normal means. Byzantine ships equipped with Greek fire projectors incinerated the Arab fleets. The formula was so carefully guarded that it was lost within a few centuries, and historians still debate the exact composition. Constantinople's survival was not just a military victory, it was a civilization-saving achievement. If Constantinople had fallen in 718 CE, there would have been nothing between the Arab armies and the heart of Europe. The cultural and intellectual heritage of the Greco-Roman world, preserved in Constantinople's libraries and monasteries, would have been destroyed or dispersed centuries before it reached the West in the form of the Renaissance. The medieval zenith, by the 9th and 10th centuries, the Byzantine Empire had found a new equilibrium, smaller than Rome at its height, but more coherent, better administered, and culturally extraordinary. Under the Macedonian dynasty, emperors with names like Basil I, Leo VI, Nicephorus Phocas, and the terrifying Basil II, Byzantium experienced a genuine renaissance. Military efficiency increased. The themes system, a military administrative organization that tied local defense to local resources, proved robust. The economy expanded. Constantinople remained the largest, richest, most cosmopolitan city in the Christian world. Basil II, who reigned from 976 to 1025 CE, earned his nickname, Basil the Bulgar Slayer, from what he did after defeating a Bulgarian army. He blinded 15,000 prisoners and sent them home, led by their one-eyed officers. The Bulgarian Tsar, upon seeing his army return, reportedly died of shock. It was a brutal act. It was also militarily effective. Bulgaria submitted. The Balkans were consolidated. The Byzantine missionaries Cyril and Methodius had created the Cyrillic alphabet and translated Christian scripture into Slavic languages. The Slavic peoples, Bulgarians, Serbs, Russians, entered the Christian world through the Byzantine door. The culture, theology, and artistic traditions that define Eastern Orthodox Christianity today were shaped in Constantinople. When Prince Vladimir of Kiev sent ambassadors to investigate the world's religions in 988 CE, his envoys visited a service at Hagia Sophia and reported back that they didn't know whether they were in heaven or on earth. Vladimir chose Christianity. Russia became Orthodox. The cultural influence of Byzantium reached far beyond its military borders. The schism and the crusade that broke everything. The relationship between the Eastern Church, centered in Constantinople, and the Western Church, centered in Rome, had been fraying for centuries over questions of theology, jurisdiction, and the eternal human question of who gets to be in charge. In 1054 CE, it snapped. Papal legates arrived in Constantinople and placed a document of excommunication on the altar of Hagia Sophia. The Patriarch of Constantinople responded by excommunicating the legates. This moment is called the Great Schism, and it divided Christianity into the Roman Catholic and Eastern Orthodox traditions, a division that continues, somewhat muted, but never fully healed to this day. The schism mattered for what came next. In 1095 CE, the Byzantine Emperor Alexios I Komnenos sent a letter to Pope Urban II, asking for military assistance against the Seljuk Turks, who had seized most of Anatolia after defeating Byzantine forces at the Battle of Manzikert in 1071 CE and were threatening Constantinople itself. Alexios wanted mercenaries. What he got was the First Crusade. The First Crusade was, from Byzantium's perspective, partially successful. It helped recover some Anatolian territory, but it also introduced large numbers of armed Western Europeans into the region with their own agendas, their own commanders, and their own complicated feelings about the Eastern Christians they were theoretically there to help. Those feelings were not always friendly. In 1204 CE, the Fourth Crusade arrived at Constantinople. It had been diverted from its original destination, Egypt, by a combination of financial obligation to Venice, internal Byzantine political crisis, and the simple logic of opportunity. On April 13, 1204 CE, the Crusaders breached the walls and sacked the city. For 3 days, the soldiers of the Fourth Crusade, Christians, theoretically on a holy mission, looted the greatest Christian city in the world. They melted down the extraordinary bronze horses from the Hippodrome, ancient Greek masterpieces. They destroyed relics. They loaded ships with treasure accumulated over centuries. A Latin empire was established in Constantinople, and it lasted 57 years. The damage was not merely material. The trust between the Eastern and Western Christian worlds, already strained, was effectively destroyed. For Byzantines thereafter, the Latin West was not a potential ally, but a predator who had already proven itself willing to attack. When they needed Western military help in the coming centuries against the Ottoman Turks, they could never quite bring themselves to trust it. The long decline and the final stand. The Byzantine Empire recovered Constantinople in 1261 CE under the Paleologan dynasty, but it recovered a city that had been looted, depopulated, and economically devastated. The empire that continued from 1261 onward was a shadow of what had preceded 1204. The Paleologan period is sometimes called a Byzantine Renaissance. Extraordinary art, vibrant theology, intense philosophical activity, scholars who had never stopped thinking seriously about Plato and Aristotle. The mosaics at Chora, now Kariye Mosque in Istanbul, from this era are among the most beautiful things produced in the medieval world. But politically and militarily, the trajectory was one of continuous contraction. From the late 13th century, a new power had been forming in northwestern Anatolia. Osman I, the founder of what would be called the Ottoman Empire, was the leader of a small Turkish principality. His successors expanded it steadily, crossing into Europe, crushing the remaining Balkan powers surrounding Constantinople on the landward side, while its sea lanes remained open. By the early 15th century, the Byzantine Empire consisted of little more than Constantinople itself, a few islands, and the Despotate of Morea in the Greek Peloponnese. The population of the city had collapsed from perhaps 800,000 at its height to perhaps 50,000. Vast sections within the famous walls were fields and orchards. Emperor John VIII Palaeologus traveled to the Council of Florence in 1439 CE, seeking Western military aid in exchange for a reunion of the Eastern and Western churches. He signed the Union Agreement. His own clergy and people rejected it. The West sent almost no military help. In 1451 CE, a 21-year-old Ottoman Sultan came to power. His name was Mehmed II. He had one goal: Constantinople. May 29, 1453. Mehmed's preparations were meticulous and modern. He commissioned a Hungarian engineer named Urban to build him the largest cannon in the world. The bombard that Urban produced could fire stone balls weighing 600 pounds a distance of a mile. Even its transportation across Thrace required teams of 60 oxen and hundreds of workers. When it was fired, it could be heard from miles away. The Byzantine Emperor, Constantine XI Palaeologus, the last emperor, the one whose name was both an echo of Rome's founder and Rome's greatest Christian emperor, had roughly 7,000 defenders to man walls that stretched for 14 miles. Mehmed had somewhere between 80 and 100,000 troops. The siege began on April 6, 1453 CE. For 53 days, the Ottoman artillery pounded the Theodosian walls, the same walls that had protected Constantinople for 1,000 years, that had beaten back Persians and Avars and Arabs and Bulgars and Rus warriors. The defenders repaired the breaches every night. They held the chain across the Golden Horn that prevented the Ottoman fleet from entering the harbor. They fought with the desperate efficiency of people who had nowhere to retreat. Mehmed improvised brilliantly. When his fleet couldn't break the chain, he built a road and transported 70 ships overland around it, launching them into the Golden Horn from the other side. The psychological impact on the defenders was enormous. On the night of May 28th to 29th, 1453 CE, the final assault began. The Genoese commander Giovanni Giustiniani, who had led the defense with extraordinary skill, was wounded and carried from the walls. His departure created a panic at the critical moment. Constantine XI, the last emperor, made his final choice. He took off his imperial regalia. He took up a sword. He charged into the breach at the gate of St. Romanus alongside the men who were dying there. He was never seen again. The Ottomans entered the city on the morning of May 29th. For 3 days, the traditional duration, which Mehmed had apparently decided to honor, the soldiers looted, or churches were converted or destroyed. The Christian population was enslaved or ransomed. Hagia Sophia, which had been a Christian church for 916 years, became a mosque that afternoon. Mehmed II rode into the Hagia Sophia and stood before the mihrab. He is reported to have said, in Persian, "The spider serves as the gatekeeper in the palace of the Khosraus. The owl sounds the relief call in the castle of Afrasiab." A quote about great empires fallen. He knew what he had ended. He called himself Kaiser-i Rum, Caesar of Rome. The Roman Empire was over. Roughly 2,200 years after Romulus's mythical foundation on the Palatine Hill. 1,973 years after Julius Caesar first crossed the Rubicon. 1,478 years after Augustus had stood before the Senate and accepted the title of first citizen. Done. Here's the question that's been underneath everything we've covered today, the question that Pompeii raised when they cracked it open in 1748 and is still waiting for an answer. Why does Rome matter? Not as history, not as an interesting sequence of events. Why does it matter now, in your life, in a world where the last Roman emperor died 600 years ago, and the language has been dead as a spoken tongue for longer than that? Here's one answer. Because Rome never actually ended. It just changed form. The laws. Justinian's Corpus Juris Civilis, organized in the 6th century, rediscovered and studied in the 11th century European universities, absorbed into the legal systems of every nation, from France to Brazil to Japan, gave us the fundamental architecture of how law works in most of the world. The presumption of innocence. The idea of legal personhood, the principle that laws must be written, public, and applied consistently. The language. Latin died as a spoken vernacular, but lived, mutated into French and Spanish, and Italian, and Portuguese and Romanian, the Romance languages, literally languages of Rome, and continued in its classical form as the language of the Catholic Church, of science, of law, of European scholarship, until well into the modern period. Half the English vocabulary is Latin-derived. When you use words like justice or government or society or military, you are speaking Roman. The architecture, the arch, the vault, the dome. Concrete, actual concrete. The Romans invented a form of marine concrete so durable that structures built with it 2,000 years ago still stand in the ocean. The Pantheon in Rome, with its 28-foot oculus open to the sky, has the largest unreinforced concrete dome in history. It has stood for 1,900 years without renovation. Every time you walk into a building with a domed ceiling, a Capitol building, a cathedral, a courthouse, you are walking into an architectural tradition that traces back to Rome. The political vocabulary, the word republic, the idea of a senate, the concept that government derives its authority not from divine right, but from the consent of the governed. The American founders read Cicero and Livy and Plutarch's lives obsessively. They named their upper legislative chamber Senate. They organized their executive branch around consular models. They took the eagle from the Roman legionary standards and put it on the Great Seal. Rome is woven into the architecture of democracy itself. The faith. Christianity was born in a Roman province, spread along Roman roads in a language, Greek, that Roman imperial culture had made universal, organized itself along Roman administrative lines, survived the empire's fall by inhabiting its institutional skeleton. The Catholic Church adopted Roman law, Roman organizational models, Latin as its sacred language. The Pope's title Pontifex Maximus was originally a Roman priestly title. The Eastern Orthodox Church preserved Greek learning and Roman administrative culture in Constantinople for a millennium. This is why Rome matters, not because of the gladiators or the emperors or the dramatic military campaigns, though those are riveting. Rome matters because we are still, in ways we're mostly not aware of, living inside Roman infrastructure, not literal roads and aqueducts, though some of those literally still exist, but conceptual infrastructure, legal infrastructure, linguistic infrastructure, political infrastructure, the lessons that won't sit still. And then there are the harder lessons, the ones that don't feel comfortable. Rome expanded until it couldn't govern what it had taken. The administrative structures of a city-state, annual magistrates, a deliberative senate, citizen assemblies, simply couldn't manage an empire spanning 3 continents. The system that worked brilliantly for a city of 100,000 people broke under the weight of 50 million. The inequality that war and conquest produced, the displacement of small farmers, the concentration of land in elite hands, the flood of slave labor that made free labor economically uncompetitive, created a political instability that the Republic never found a way to address. The Gracchi tried. They were killed. The problem was eventually resolved not by reform, but by the Republic's collapse into one-man rule. The transition from citizen soldier to professional army was militarily necessary and politically catastrophic. An army loyal to its general rather than to the state is a coup waiting for the right moment. Once Marius made that transition, the question was never whether there would be civil wars, but only how many and who would win. And the succession problem: no system, not the Republic, not the Principate, not the Tetrarchy, ever fully solved the question of how to transfer power without violence. The best the Romans managed was the adoption system of the 5 good emperors, which worked brilliantly for a century and then ended when Marcus Aurelius chose blood over merit. You can draw your own parallels. I'm not going to draw them for you, but they're there. What Rome ultimately teaches us is not a simple lesson about decline and fall, not a morality tale about luxury corrupting virtue or barbarians at the gate. It teaches us something more uncomfortable, that great civilizations are not ended by external forces alone. They are unmade from within, by the accumulated weight of unresolved contradictions, by the failure of institutions to adapt to changed circumstances, by the preference of powerful groups for short-term advantage over long-term stability. And yet, and this is important, they don't simply end, they transform. The people who looked out from Constantinople's walls and called themselves Romans were not wrong to do so. The scholars who fled to Italy after 1453, carrying manuscripts of Plato and Aristotle, were carrying Rome with them into the Renaissance that would shape the modern world. The legal codes, the architectural forms, the political concepts, the faith, all of it transformed and continued, and continues still. That's the thing that the ash of Pompeii is actually preserving. Not just a Tuesday morning, not just a loaf of bread and a dog and someone's love life written on a wall. It's preserving the evidence that human civilization is not a straight line of progress. interrupted by catastrophes. It's a continuous process of building and adaptation and loss and rebuilding, in which what seems lost is often only transformed. Rome fell. Rome never fell. Rome is still here. Look around. All things human are brief and perishable, and no part of our life is so frail and fleeting as that which is the most glorious. Pliny the Younger, writing after the eruption of Vesuvius, 79 CE. A final note. If you've made it this far, thank you. The story we've covered today spans 22 centuries, 3 continents, and more lives than any history could fully contain. What we've told is necessarily incomplete. Every chapter we covered could be, has been, the subject of entire books and careers of scholarship. The sources we drew on: Livy's History of Rome, Polybius, Suetonius's Lives of the 12 Caesars, Tacitus's Annals, Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic War, Plutarch's Lives, Procopius on Justinian, the Chronicles of the Byzantine historians, and the extraordinary body of modern scholarship: Mary Beard, Tom Holland, Adrian Goldsworthy, Anthony Caldelis, and dozens of others, that has spent the last century patiently excavating what the ancient sources got right, what they exaggerated, what they invented, and what they missed. History is argument. The Rome presented here reflects the best current understanding, but current understanding changes. New excavations, new readings of old texts, new theoretical frameworks, all of them continue to reshape what we think we know about the civilization that shaped us. Keep asking questions. Keep reading. Keep arguing. That's what Rome would have wanted.